Writers such as Rubén Darío, who create their own artistic personas and styles through the open imitation of a wide variety of models, proudly posing as something they are not, in spite of the accusations of inauthenticity this might produce. So fashion and art are therefore two very important channels for the development of snobbery because of their link to the aesthetic, I think. So let me transition towards the last part of my talk, which has to do more with, again with Cuba, but more specifically with passing. And I will transition by talking about the link between fashion and art and the importance of fashion in the 19th century. And I'll use a quote by Walter Benjamin. You might recall something that Benjamin points out in Paris, the capital of the 19th century. He says that the snob articulates his or her authority in the realm of art. He says, according to Benjamin, and I quote him, "The art that begins to doubt its task and ceases to be inseparable from utility must make novelty into its highest value. The arbiter novarum rerum for such an art becomes the snob. He is to art what the dandy is to fashion." So, according to Benjamin, snobbery carries with it a certain aesthetic authority in the world of art. But at the same time, that authority has a clear parallel in fashion, because both fashion and art are governed by the same principle, the new. But it would be a mistake to think of this parallel or this analogy as simply that, as a parallel or an analogy. Fashion, I would like to point out, was often considered during the 19th century as a force similar to progress. That's why I think that we can take Benjamin's words even further and transform the parallelism into a dialectical relationship. We could say, in that sense, that art and literature had started to be affected by fashion, now in a broader sense. For example, it was now possible that authors became fashionable, that others go out of fashion, and that new artists are valued because their work is perceived as new. Art, therefore, responded to fashion. But fashion, conversely, is an aesthetic practice, and one that responds to the same modern principle as art, the new. The snob, according to Benjamin, is the person who knows what's new in art. The dandy, the person who knows what's new in fashion. Now, as you must have noticed, I am using the word snob in a different way. In my analysis, what Benjamin calls the snob is an art snob. What he calls a dandy is a fashion snob, right? I think that when you pay attention to the realm of fashion, of everyday life, it is relatively easy to visualize that the history of snobbery goes beyond art or the art snob. From this perspective, it is also evident, as I would like to point out, that the problem of snobbery is inseparable from that of social distinction. In very broad terms, we could say that, very, very broad terms, we could say that with bourgeois revolutions, bourgeois revolutions drastically redefined the criteria for making visible social hierarchies in nations where hereditary distinction by blood, was less and less respected, right? With this transformation, fashion becomes one of the central social mechanisms for determining your place in society. The rigidity of sumptuary laws, whose purpose was to distinguish social classes or castes by preventing plebeians or slaves, for example, from consuming certain kinds of materials, and clothing limited to higher social strata. The rigidity of the sumptuary laws is eventually replaced by the ephemeral character of fashion. In the opinion of social theorists such as Arjun Appadurai, the constant renewal of fashion has as its main objective to distinguish between those of us who have the economic, social, and cultural capital needed to be up to date from those of us who, lacking those forms of capital, constantly find ourselves a step behind. As social mobility increases, the importance of fashion necessarily grows as part of a daily hermeneutics for understanding the who is who in a given society. So in the few minutes that I have left, I will refer once more to the case of Havana, where fashion and other forms of snobbery played a central role since the late 18th century. And I will try to make it more explicit the link between snobbery and the problem of passing, racial passing, for example. The expansion of the Cuban economy that began in the second half of the 18th century meant that compared to other cities in Latin America, Havana allowed its citizens a higher social mobility at all levels. You had slaves who purchased freedom to reach right? Who would purchase their own freedom. You have also planters who purchased titles of nobility. Black made an effort to pass as mulattoes. Mulattoes made an effort to pass as white. And whites made an effort to pass as members of a higher class than the one they actually belonged to. So Cuban literature of this period constantly represents the anxieties that arouse with social mobility in the spheres of white and people of color. In a society as dependent on slave labor as Cuba, the snobbery of the white population could hardly be isolated from questions of race. And most of studies of the first decades of the 19th century in Cuba refer, for example, to the specter of Haiti, right? The possibility of a slave uprising similar to the one that took place in the neighboring island. I would like to suggest, however, that the anxiety produced by the great numbers of blacks present in Cuba was also the result of very small rebellions much less violent, but not necessarily for that less insidious. I am referring to the constant struggle on the part of free people of color for social mobility. Blood imposed a very clear limit to social mobility, of course, but it would be a mistake to consider this limit totally insurmountable. In fact, it has been argued that the reinvention of the concept of purity of blood during the 19th century was a direct consequence of both miscegenation and the economic prosperity of the free people of color, who in many cases were very, very rich. In this sense, we could say that the discourse on national identity that begins to take shape with Romanticism derived part of its force from the anxieties over growing social mobility. In other words, the efforts to establish a Cuban identity were parallel to the daily snobbery of a myriad of subjects who tried to construct their own social identity, both by passing as more respectable than what they were, or by looking down on those who were doing the same thing at a lower level. Let's take the case of Cecilia Valdez by Cirilo Villaverde, a text that is central in the canon of 19th century Latin American literature. Cecilia Valdez is an extended reflection on social hierarchies and therefore on a variety of efforts to pass, both in terms of race and class. Cecilia, the almost white mulatta, has a dream to marry a white man, and she also has a nightmare to give birth to a saltatras, a baby darker than her that would destroy her whitening efforts. As a poor and illegitimate child, her position in society is extremely vulnerable. Her biological father, the Spanish merchant Don Candido, has a very different social standing. However, he is also concerned with upward mobility, and he even tries to buy a title of count. His legitimate son, Leonardo, mockingly refers to him as Count of the Slave Quarters, Conde del Barracón, because Don Candido owes part of his fortune to the slave trade. Since its very beginning, the novel poses us two resonant questions. Will Cecilia be able to marry a white man, or will she always be tainted by her black blood? And also, will Don Candido be able to become a nobleman? In other words, will his money allow him to enter into the highest strata of Cuban society, or will he just be regarded as an upstart? If Don Candido pins his hopes of a higher social standing on the acquisition of a nobility title, his son, Leonardo, understands that social distinction is now more dependent on the fleeting subtleties of fashion. As Sean Latham has put it for a different context, he understands that his world is ruled less by the laws of inheritance than by the rule of the fashionable signifier. Villaverde spends many pages of the novel describing how the frivolous Leonardo, the son, takes care of his public appearance. He censors his snobbery, but not by saying that Leonardo wants to be something that he's not. As a matter of fact, Leonardo is depicted as a triumphant snob, at least within the frivolous milieu of higher classes in Havana. So it is clear that in spite of the obvious abyss between an illegitimate mulata like Cecilia and a rich Spanish gentleman, the ghost of social mobility affected all sectors of society. In fact, when we analyze the anxiety and denunciations spawned by upward mobility, we find that passing as someone of high rank was perceived as a deceit very similar to that of passing as white. In both cases, for example, the attempt at passing is described as a fraud. And this leads us back to the realm of fashion, where fraud occupies a prominent position, I think. What is out of fashion is abject, precisely because it reveals an attempt at fraud, an attempt to look like something that one is really not. It reveals the construction that is of a simulacrum. There is a short fictional text by Villaverde entitled La tejedora de sombreros de Yarey, the weaver of palm-frond hats, published around 1844. And this short story, it's basically the story of a gentleman whose noble and unlikely benevolence leads him to prefer a hat made with palm leaves by a poor girl over all the other hats available at the store. The puzzled salesman puts him in his place. No decent person asked me for palm frond hats, really. Ninguna persona decente me pide sombreros de Yarey, la verdad. The salesman acts moved by his equally ignoble and unlikely evilness. He does not care about selling the hat left there in consignment by the poor girl. Ironically, his remark to the gentleman generates one of the most believable moments of the story. The salesman shows that his main purpose is not to do good, but to make money, and the gentleman must face the fact that a man of his condition cannot wear hats of palm. But the salesman not only reminds the absent-minded buyer what the fashion is, he also explicitly links not being in fashion with the aforementioned attempt at fraud. Palm frond hats fool you from afar, he says. They are like certain women. Composed and powdered, they fool anyone, but up close they inspire fear at the same time. Estos sombreros, los de Yarey, engañan de lejos, se parecen a ciertas mujeres, compuestas y encascarilladas, le dan un gatazo a cualquiera, pero miradas de cerca meten miedo al mismo tiempo. Once again, here we find a failed attempt at passing. Like those women, like Cecilia, even like Don Candido, the palm leaves cannot hide their indignity. And indignity, in this as in other cases, is racially charged. Encascarillada, what I translated as powdered, refers to the act of using cascarilla, that is the cosmetics made with white eggshell and that serve to whiten one's skin. The fraud is therefore clearly associated with racial passing. The fact that the unfashionable hat is directly linked to passing is a clear sign that Cubans understood the logic of fashion and the logic of caste divisions in very similar terms. At the same time, it is clear that neither the white-black racial division or the in-out division that characterizes fashion were very easy to establish. Although I have used the phrase failed attempts at passing, we should know that this is not a complete failure. Villaverde does not tell us that when looked at from a short distance, deceitful women inspire fear. He tells us that they inspire fear at the same time. This entails that their appeal coexists with its negation, according to a paradox very similar to that of the simulacrum, that which is and is not at the same time, thus calling into question the Platonic paradigm of model and copy. And it is very interesting to know that in Plato, as in colonial Cuba, the question of passing and false lineage plays a very important role. And just about to finish, but let me just speak a little bit about Plato. As you know, Platonism establishes a very clear distinction between model and copy, giving the former an absolute preeminence over the latter. In this way, the simulacrum is usually thought of as a copy of the copy, right? A false copy, a ghost. The Platonic system, in this sense, shows an intense drive towards classification, according to which it is imperative to distinguish between the authentic and the inauthentic. In both difference and repetition and the logic of sense, Gilles Deleuze comments that Plato's main objective is to select among lineages, to distinguish suitors, to distinguish between pure and impure, authentic and inauthentic. To distinguish a just person, for example, the Platonic system leads us to consider the division between the idea of justice, the quality of justice, and the just person. Deleuze equates these three terms to the figures of the father, the idea of justice, the daughter, the quality of justice, and the suitor, the just person, right? The legitimate suitor, the really just person, relates to the father or to the idea of justice in a way that is similar to the one we used to think of the relationship to the model or to the origin. The false or illegitimate suitor, on the other hand, can only take hold of the daughter by violence and by ruse, skipping the mediation of the father. Simulacrum is like the false suitor in the sense that even though it lacks true resemblance to the original, it manages to hide it. The simulacrum is not what it seems to be, but it can easily deceive us and make us believe the contrary. The palm-frond hat, for example, that looks decent to the absent-minded gentleman. Or Cecilia, whose skin is as white as that of many decent women born in Spain, but whose blood cannot be considered pure from a legal point of view, and whose condition as an illegitimate child, her lack of lineage, reinforces her inability to become a true suitor to whiteness. The Rastaquoero, simulacrum of a gentleman. The Cuban Romantica, simulacrum of a character in a French novel. Don Candido, simulacrum of a count. Cecilia, simulacrum of a white woman. These are, of course, heterogeneous examples, and each of them would demand an attention to contextual specificity. But today I was more interested in exploring what they all have in common, in showing you that all of them can be considered snobs who are questioned, snobs that fail because their performances are perceived as inauthentic, as fraud. In the same way, I hope I have allowed you to at least glimpse another more successful form of snobbery, that of the dandy. And most of all, I hope by now it is clear that snobbery is a very slippery concept, defined in ways that are often contradictory and always relational. In closing, I would like to suggest that the difficulty of distinguishing the triumphant snob and the snob who is questioned lies in the fact that 2,500 years after Plato, the relationship between model, copy, and simulacrum is still not very clear. So the next time you see a snob, ask yourself, is this person just a poser, or is this person a true artist of identity, as all of us are? That's all. Oh, if you can think of more synonyms in Spanish for snob, for example, in certain countries that I don't work on, I would be happy to hear that now or later, making a collection of synonyms.
About 10 minutes for questions.
So I was struck by this idea of performance as being something that can be authentic. To see the distinction between performance authentic and performance inauthentic. And I was wondering if a performance that is authentic wouldn't result in eccentricity rather than snobbery. And this is like a term that I would like you to maybe address, the idea of eccentricity. Because I think it's related and it's close, but
Yeah, totally. Two things. First, thanks for bringing that up. For us, or for us in academia, I guess, I don't know about the whole world, but I guess in the last decades, it's become very clear that, performance is everything, right? I mean, after Gilles Deleuze, after Judith Butler, it's very hard for us at least to say that, you are not what you pretend to be. I mean, it's even politically incorrect in most instances. So it's interesting to me to go and analyze the 19th century and see how the relationship to the legitimacy of performance as a way of achieving or acquiring an identity changes, right? And I think, as I mentioned first, it's more on the side of the eccentric or the snob, and I will talk about that now. And then, with Modernismo in particular, you can see how certain social public performances are so legitimate that people like Rubén Darío people start considering them authentic, even though they're obviously performing, right? So there is an interesting change there that has to do, as I mentioned, with the movement towards the greater legitimacy of the aesthetic in their Republic of Letters. So I said that the closer it gets to the aesthetic, the more legitimate snobbery seems to become, for example, in writers. But that's a good question. I mean, what's the difference between, an eccentric person, snob person? I mean, it changes according to the context. I would say that I am doing here more than a history of snobbery. It becomes a prehistory when I trace social types such as the petit maître, right? Because the petit maître is perceived as eccentric, right? He's a ridiculous person in the 18th century, for example. Why would I consider the petit maître a snob? If snob has more to do, I put snob in relationship to this passion for the new, or this search for the new. Well, because I think in the petit maître you already find in certain instances glimpses of this modern attitude that has to do with what we could, what we could call a desire for something else, for something new. That something else could be something different, and that would be just your eccentric. But it could also be something that comes from France, for example. And the petit maître, as the word itself suggests, has to do with imitating what is French. So little by little, the eccentric is replaced by this figure who is more obsessed with the new. And if I had to make a broad definition of snobbery, I would define it as a modern kind of eccentricity, and actually as a modern form of articulation of social distinction, right? We could think of social distinction throughout the centuries as something that was always there, and then with the emergence of fashion, we could see snobbery as a new way of exhibiting your rank, exhibiting your cultural capital in order to show where your position in society is. I think that would be another way to look at the difference. Yeah. Long answer, sorry.
Thanks a lot for that. I guess I had two maybe related points, but one thing is you're not, this whole idea of authenticity and kind of simulacrum and copy and stuff. I mean, the examples that you're using are characters from novels which are simulacrum, right? I think there's another level of, and I mean, maybe you get at this in your work, but there's another level of kind of falseness there. Because these aren't real people, they're invented people. And then with respect to that, I'm wondering if, I guess, and I might have not understood this exactly right, but it seems like the earlier novelists that you're talking about are kind of more down on the snobbish characters. So they're actually more snobbish, because they're kind of denouncing the snob. Whereas the later ones are more sympathetic to the snobbery made. Is this right? And then, in which case, if that were the case, then they would be less snobbish as writers. You know what I mean? They're inventing people that they have less disdain for, or something like that. I don't.
Thanks for the first question. Yes, most of my examples, yeah, come from fictional texts. But when Gómez Carrillo talks to or writes to Rubén Darío, he's referring to like a real person. Maybe, yes. Maybe I should have clarified a little bit better the difference between my characters, because they are all like flattened here in my talk at the same level. But yeah, I will think about that, especially if I have to present this work again, how to organize it, right? And maybe in terms of, of my own example. The second question, I think, has in part to do with what I was recently saying just now, because I don't know if denouncing